what I'm going to present in the next 12 or 13 minutes is actually taken from two papers. We have one paper based on methodology and another sort of focused on empirical measurement. And if you're at all interested in the topic, and I'll just be able to give you a little bit of an introduction to that topic. Okay, so let's kind of return just for a moment to this definition of resilience, the ability to recover from some kind of difficulty. And I think implicit in the idea of resilience, whether we're talking about it at the level of an individual, a household, or a community, is this idea that the way that the individual or household or community bounces back from a difficulty is important, and that the speed of that bounce back is important as well. So implicit in this is the idea that in some sense when a household encounters a difficulty, then it responds and reacts and bounces back relatively quickly. So as we know, many households, individuals encounter unexpected events. There's crop loss, there's price spikes, there's illnesses, there's death, and all of these shocks can lead to a range of adverse outcomes. And most important to us here today are nutrition shortfalls that might result from adverse outcomes. Building resilience, of course, can help promote well-being, but it may differ across subgroups of the population, as Dr. Mock has indicated. So we approach this from the perspective of empirical measurement and asking whether we can develop tools or methods that might allow us to quantify and measure resilience in a much more standard and rigorous way. So the graph that's on the screen here is taken from 4,500 children below age 5, 2 rounds of the Poshan data set. And on the x-axis, I've put height for age z-score in 1 year, and then on the y-axis, height for age z-score in subsequent year. And each circle, each dot in the graph represents a child. And the 45-degree line would kind of indicate children who are kind of in stasis. From one period to the next, their z-score has not changed. And obviously, what we see in the graph is that there's a lot of movement around that line. And we might speculate as to why that movement occurs. In some cases, it may be due to unexpected shocks or events. And we want to move in the direction of trying to develop a method that will allow us to think about resilience and think about movement in that kind of space. So the objectives for the paper are to develop a method. For now, we're going to ignore where the shocks come from and just focus on observations of displacement. We're going to apply the method to two survey data sets, one from Nepal and one from Bangladesh. And we're not going to be talking about anthropometry, but instead about dietary diversity. Anthropometry is a much more complicated topic. Dietary diversity can be easily observed over time. And we're going to focus on mothers and children. And then what we want to do is test whether there are patterns of resilience that differ across subgroups. Okay? So the concept that we're working with here is akin to what we might call mean reversion. And some of you may have heard that term from financial markets. The idea that once a shock or displacement occurs, that there's a tendency for individuals or firms or communities to return to a previous state. And we want to actually be able to measure that. So we're going to define nutritionally resilient households or individuals as those that satisfy 3 conditions. First, we have to observe that they experience some kind of reduction in their dietary diversity score. Second, that they subsequently experience a recovery, so they bounce back from whatever adversity they faced. And third, that bounce back or that return, that recovery, is faster or greater than we might expect. And this, from a measurement point of view, is key. So what this approach requires is that we observe an outcome at 3 distinct points in time. So if we were talking about children, we'd want to observe the anthropometry of those children at 3 points in time. In the case of dietary diversity scores, we're going to look at diets at 3 different points in time. An initial baseline, a change from that baseline, and then the subsequent outcome. So just to kind of give you a mental image of the idea here, we can imagine that in period 1 we observe some kind of outcome, and we'll think about dietary diversity as that outcome. And then in a subsequent period, maybe some kind of adverse effect that causes dietary diversity to decline, followed by some period of recovery. Okay, and so across these 3 periods, we see a shock, we see some decline, we see some kind of recovery, and then there's some kind of continued progression. Okay, so we observe a decline and we observe a rebound, but that doesn't necessarily satisfy our definition of resilience, because we have in mind a comparison case, which might be a household that experiences a similar kind of shock but responds in a positive way, and then returns to sort of a baseline subsequent to that. And so the question that we really have is that if 2 households face the same kind of shock, in that 3rd period, is the return faster for the household that had the adverse shock than for a household that maybe had a positive shock? So in other words, we want to have some way to compare the response in a sort of measurable standard way. So to go back to the idea that we have 3 periods, we might observe that there are 2 groups who in an initial period both experience some decline. One group recovers, one group declines further. We may have 2 groups, one that shows improvement followed by subsequent improvement, or one that we observe improvement followed by a decline. Some of you have heard the term poverty trap used. So households that might have an initial decline followed by a subsequent decline would be those that might be falling into a poverty trap. In the upper right-hand corner, we have households that might have sustained gains and improvements over time. And what we're really interested in are these 2 sort of off-diagonal areas where we can compare the recovery after a decline to a decline after an increase. So we're looking here for some kind of test that compares the symmetry of the response in the 2 groups. Now, I'm an economist by training, so that means I have to show you at least one equation. That equation is at the top. We have an econometric approach to doing this, and it requires that we test the coefficient in a regression equation, and we're really sort of interested in the slope of those 2 responses in those 2 off-diagonal quadrants. And if the slopes are equal for those who have a positive and a negative response to a shock, then we might say that there's no true resilience because the reversion to the mean is not different from what we might expect. In the other case, if the recovery after the decline is greater than we might expect, in other words, greater than we might see in the sort of mirror image case, then we would conclude that there's some asymmetry in the response and that recovery has occurred. Okay, so that's the basic technical setup. And now we want to take it to the data, and we're going to look at women and children in Nepal and in Bangladesh. And we're going to ask the question, when we look at dietary diversity, and we look at changes in dietary diversity over time, and we see households, or in this case, individuals whose dietary diversity has declined, do we see evidence of resilience in the data set in the sense that people's diets recover and respond and return to a pre-shock circumstance? And I won't spend a lot of time talking about the coefficients or what they actually mean. Instead, I'll just tell you that what we find is that in Nepal, there is evidence of resilience in the sense that following a decline in dietary diversity, we see a bounce back. In Bangladesh, we don't see that same evidence in the sample. In other words, the households or the individuals are not resilient in the sense that their dietary diversity, once it declines, does not return to the level that we would expect. The other thing that we can do with this method or approach is ask whether resilience, this measured response in a regression framework, differs by subgroups of the population. And in Nepal, we find that nutritional resilience does vary. It varies both across space and across households. And we find that the most resilient individuals are women and children who come from households that are more market-oriented, those with more assets, and those with better access to credit. And so to return to Dr. Mach's points from before, these are all forms of enabling that would allow households to respond to a shock in a favorable way. The other thing that we find is that children that come from districts that have more developed infrastructure, those longer-term kinds of, I believe you call them transformative factors, do exhibit greater resilience in the sample. So that's the 15-minute introduction to the topic. If you're interested in the methods, we have a paper on the methods. If you're interested in the application, we also have a paper on the application, and I'd be happy to share those with you or to talk with you during the breaks. So thank you for your attention.